The afternoon of October 21st, 1945, brought an unseasonable chill to the flat expanse of Texas prairie surrounding Camp Swift, 15 miles east of Austin. Greta Hoffmann pressed her hands against the chain-link fence, watching a dust devil spin across the compound yard, carrying with it the brittle leaves of late autumn and the constant reminder that she remained a prisoner in a foreign land. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. Behind her, 32 other German women huddled in small groups, speaking in hushed German about the peculiar announcement that had echoed through the barracks an hour earlier. They'd been summoned to the camp administration building for what Captain Morrison called a special opportunity, words that filled them with equal measures of hope and dread. Hope, because anything that broke the monotony of captivity felt like reprieve. Dread, because in their experience, special opportunities from captors usually concealed some new humiliation disguised as privilege. Greta was 24 years old, though the past year had aged her beyond her chronological years in ways that no mirror could fully capture. She'd served as a Nachrichtenhelferin, a signals auxiliary, with the Wehrmacht's communications division in France, until her capture during the chaotic Allied advance in the summer of 1944. Along with hundreds of other female auxiliaries, nurses, clerks, and radio operators, she'd been processed through military channels designed almost entirely for men, then shipped across the Atlantic to Texas, where the heat felt like punishment and the landscape resembled photographs of Mars more than Earth. According to records maintained in the National Archives at College Park, Maryland, approximately 500,000 women served in German auxiliary forces by 1945, filling roles in communications, clerical work, and support services that freed men for combat. Most were young, educated, and had volunteered or been conscripted as Germany grew desperate in the war's final years. When captured, these women occupied an ambiguous legal category, technically prisoners of war, yet processed through systems unprepared for their presence. The 33 women gathered outside the administration building that October afternoon represented a cross-section of Germany's collapsing war machine. There was Ilse Bachmann from Hamburg, a telephone operator who'd watched her city burn under Allied bombs. Margarete Klein from Dresden, whose entire family had perished in the February firebombing. Anna Schulz from Munich, barely 20 years old, who'd lied about her age to join the Signals Corps. And Greta herself, from a small village outside Frankfurt that no longer existed except in her increasingly unreliable memory. Captain Eleanor Morrison emerged from the building precisely at 1400 hours, her Women's Army Corps uniform crisp despite the dust, her clipboard held with the practiced efficiency of someone who'd learned to navigate military bureaucracy through sheer determination. At 34, Morrison had fought for this assignment, managing female German prisoners at Camp Swift, arguing to skeptical superiors that women deserved female administrators who might better understand their unique circumstances. She'd arrived in September to find the German women segregated from the main prisoner population, housed in a converted section of the camp originally designed for storage, surviving on the same rations as male prisoners, but lacking adequate facilities for basic hygiene. Morrison had spent her first month requisitioning supplies, arguing with supply sergeants who questioned why enemy women needed sanitary products or properly fitting uniforms, and gradually transforming the makeshift barracks into something approaching livable conditions. Aufstellung, she called in her carefully practiced German, gesturing for the women to form ranks. Her accent was thick, shaped by classes at a Midwest university before the war, but comprehensible. The prisoners assembled with the automatic precision of people who'd spent years responding to military commands, even if those commands now came from former enemies. "I have received," Morrison began, consulting her clipboard before switching to English, while Sergeant Dorothy Klein translated, "An unusual request. Mrs. Katharina Hoffmann, no relation to any of you." She glanced at Greta. "Owns a ranch 20 miles south of here with her husband Wilhelm. She has written to camp headquarters requesting permission to host several German women prisoners for Sunday dinner on the 28th. She is aware of your status. She is aware of the regulations. She has nevertheless petitioned military authorities for this opportunity, and headquarters has granted approval under specific conditions. A ripple passed through the assembled prisoners. Sunday dinner. The words seemed to belong to a different reality, one where prisoners and captors didn't exist, where women gathered around tables for reasons beyond survival, where social rituals continued despite everything the war had destroyed. Morrison continued reading. Mrs. Hoffmann, who is herself German, immigrated to Texas in 1923. Her 2 sons served in the United States Army. One was killed at Normandy, the other lost his left arm at the Bulge. Despite this, Morrison paused, allowing Klein's translation to catch up, letting the weight of those facts settle among the prisoners. She has requested this dinner. She has specified that she wishes to host German women, not men. She has prepared her home accordingly. Transportation will be provided. You will be accompanied by female guards. This is entirely voluntary. Those who wish to participate should indicate so now. Silence descended, broken only by the wind rattling the chain-link fence and the distant sound of male prisoners playing football in another section of the camp. Greta exchanged glances with Ilse, seeing her own confusion reflected back. A German woman who'd lost one son and watched another maimed, inviting enemy women to her table. It defied comprehension. It defied the categories of victim and perpetrator, ally and enemy that had structured their understanding of the war. Why? The question came from Margaretha, whose voice still carried the proper cadences of Dresden's educated class despite months of privation. Why would she want this? We served the regime that sent men to kill her sons. We are the enemy. Morrison lowered her clipboard, and something softened in her military bearing. I asked her the same question when she first submitted her request. She said, Morrison consulted her notes, finding the exact quote, because they are someone's daughters, because before they were soldiers, they were girls who had mothers who worried about them, because my sons fought against Germany, not against every German who ever lived. The answer hung in the air, neither satisfying nor dismissing the complexity of the situation. Anna Schultz, the youngest, raised her hand tentatively. Will she hesitated, searching for English words before reverting to German for Klein to translate. Will she want us to apologize? To explain ourselves? To justify why we served? Mrs. Hoffmann's letter, Morrison replied carefully, specifies that this is a dinner, not an interrogation. She asks only that you come if you wish, that you observe basic courtesy, and that you allow her to offer hospitality. Nothing more. Greta found herself speaking before conscious thought could intervene. I will go. The words emerged with certainty she hadn't known she possessed. Around her, several other women nodded, including Ilse and Margaretha. Eventually, 15 women volunteered, driven by curiosity, by the desperate desire for something different, by the slim possibility that perhaps the world contained more complexity than their imprisonment suggested. The week between Morrison's announcement and the appointed Sunday passed with agonizing slowness. The women who'd volunteered found themselves subjects of fascination and suspicion among those who'd declined. Some prisoners viewed the invitation as manipulation, a psychological tactic designed to break down resistance through kindness more insidious than cruelty. Others saw it as an incomprehensible act of forgiveness they didn't deserve and weren't sure they could accept. Greta lay awake the night before the dinner, staring at the ceiling of the barracks while Ilse snored softly in the adjacent bunk. She thought about the Hoffmann woman, trying to imagine the mother who'd sacrificed 2 sons, yet still saw German women as daughters rather than enemies. She thought about her own mother, dead now almost certainly, buried under the retime, the rubble of Frankfurt, along with her father and younger brother. She thought about the arbitrary nature of survival, how she'd lived while so many hadn't, how geography and timing and pure chance had placed her here in Texas, rather than under a collapsed building or on a forced march or in front of a firing squad. Sunday morning arrived with crystalline autumn clarity, the kind of October day that made Texas almost beautiful despite its harsh extremes. The 15 volunteers assembled in the yard at 0900 hours, wearing the cleanest versions of their prison uniforms that weeks of careful washing could produce. Captain Morrison had authorized the use of limited cosmetics from the canteen, and several women had attempted to style their hair into something approaching femininity after months of practical neglect. 2 military trucks arrived, driven by WAC personnel, accompanied by 4 female guards carrying sidearms but no rifles. Morrison addressed the group one final time before departure. "You represent not just yourselves today, but all the German women in this camp. You represent the possibility that enemies can share a meal without violence. You represent the hope that reconciliation might be possible even when forgiveness seems impossible. Conduct yourselves accordingly." The drive south from Camp Swift took 40 minutes, following farm roads that cut through landscapes so different from Germany that Greta felt she'd travelled to another planet entirely. The flat prairie stretched endlessly, broken occasionally by clusters of oak trees and distant ranch houses that seemed impossibly isolated. The sky was enormous, overwhelming, nothing like the close horizons of the Rhine Valley where she'd grown up. Ilse sat beside her in the truck bed, gripping the wooden bench as they bounced over rutted roads. "Do you think," Ilse said quietly in German, "that we will be able to eat? My stomach has been in knots since yesterday. I cannot remember the last time. I felt nervous about a dinner." "Camp meals aren't exactly dinners," Margarethe interjected from across the truck. "They're more like fuel deliveries. This will be different. This will be actual food, prepared by someone who cares whether it tastes good." Anna, sitting with her back against the cab, looked younger than her 20 years. "What if we say the wrong thing? What if we make her cry thinking about her sons? What if we remind her too much of the enemy?" "Then we remind her of the enemy," Greta replied, surprising herself with the firmness of her tone. "We are the enemy, or we were, or we still are. The categories no longer make sense, but we can't pretend to be something other than what we are." The Hoffmann ranch appeared on the horizon as they crested a low rise. A modest but well-maintained collection of buildings centered around a 2-story farmhouse with a wraparound porch. The main house was painted white with green trim, surrounded by carefully tended flower beds that bloomed despite the season. A red barn stood to one side, its doors open to reveal farm equipment and stacked hay bales. Several horses grazed in a fenced pasture, their coats gleaming in the morning sun. As the trucks approached, Greta saw a woman emerge onto the porch, wiping her hands on an apron. Even from a distance, she could see the woman was older, perhaps in her mid-50s, with grey hair pulled back in a practical bun. She stood watching their arrival with an expression Greta couldn't quite read at this distance, somewhere between apprehension and determination. The trucks pulled into the yard and stopped. For a moment, nobody moved. The German prisoners remained in the truck beds, suddenly aware of how surreal this situation was. They were enemy soldiers being invited to Sunday dinner by a woman whose sons they'd fought against, whose country they'd tried to defeat, whose life they'd helped destroy through their service to a regime that had brought catastrophe to the world. Captain Morrison jumped down from the cab of the lead truck and approached the woman on the porch. They spoke briefly, too quietly for the prisoners to hear. Then Morrison turned and gestured for the women to disembark. Greta climbed down from the truck, her legs stiff from the drive, and found herself standing in Texas dirt, facing a German woman who'd become American, whose sons had become American soldiers, whose grief and generosity had created this impossible moment. Katharina Hoffmann descended the porch steps, removing her apron as she approached. She was shorter than Greta had expected, perhaps 5 feet 2 inches, but she moved with the confident bearing of someone accustomed to running a ranch and a household. Her face bore the weathering of years spent under the Texas sun, but her eyes, when they met Greta's, held neither hatred nor judgment. Instead, they held recognition, the look of one woman seeing another across the gulf of war, national loyalty, and manufactured enmity. "Willkommen," she said in German, her accent untainted by decades in America. "Welcome to my home. Thank you for coming. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. The silence that followed Greta Hoffmann's welcome stretched long enough to become uncomfortable. 15 German prisoners stood in the ranch yard, their modified uniforms marking them as enemy combatants, while a German-American woman whose sons had been casualties of their country's aggression offered them hospitality. The contradiction was so profound that none of the prisoners seemed capable of formulating an appropriate response. Finally, Greta stepped forward, her voice barely above a whisper. "Frau Hoffmann, we do not understand why you would want this. Captain Morrison told us about your sons. We are so sorry for your loss." Though something flickered in her eyes at the mention of her sons. "Come," she said simply, gesturing toward the house. "We will talk while we prepare the meal. I did not invite you here to stand in my yard looking uncomfortable. I invited you to share food and perhaps to remember, for a few hours, that we are all human beings who have suffered through the same terrible war." She turned and walked back toward the porch, not looking to see if they would follow. After a moment's hesitation, Greta moved first, and the others followed in a tentative procession. Captain Morrison and the guards maintained a discreet distance, positioning themselves near the trucks where they could observe but not intrude. The interior of the Hoffmann house smelled of baking bread and roasting meat, scents so powerfully evocative of home and normalcy that several of the women stopped just inside the doorway, momentarily overwhelmed. The living room was modestly furnished but scrupulously clean, with photographs on the mantelpiece showing 2 young men in American military uniforms, their faces frozen in the optimism of youth before war had taught them different lessons. Katharina led them through to the kitchen, a large room dominated by a massive wooden table and a cast-iron stove that radiated warmth. Bowls of vegetables sat on the counter waiting to be prepared, and a roast chicken rested on a platter, golden and perfect. The kitchen windows looked out over the prairie, offering views of endless sky and distant horizons. "I have been cooking since yesterday," Katharina said, rolling up her sleeves. "But there is still much to do, and I would appreciate help. In my experience, the best conversations happen while hands are busy with useful work. So," she gestured to the vegetables, "who knows how to peel potatoes?" The request was so ordinary, so domestic, so removed from their status as prisoners, that it broke through the paralyzing formality. Ilse moved to the sink, followed by Margarethe and Anna. Soon, half the women were working at various tasks, peeling potatoes, chopping carrots, shelling peas, while the others arranged chairs around the expanded table that Katharina had set up to accommodate everyone. As they worked, Katharina spoke, her German flowing easily despite her years in Texas. "I came to America in 1923, she began, measuring flour for dumplings. I was 18 years old, traveling with my older sister to marry a man I had never met. Wilhelm had immigrated 5 years earlier, worked on ranches to save money, and sent for a German bride through a matchmaking service. It was not romantic, but it was practical. Germany after the First War was..." She paused, searching for words. Germany was broken, starving, humiliated. I saw no future there. Greta glanced up from the carrots she was chopping. "Did you regret leaving?" "At first, yes. Texas was so different from Bavaria. The heat, the isolation, the language I could barely speak. I cried every night for 6 months. Katharina smiled ruefully at the memory. But Wilhelm was kind. He was patient with my homesickness. He taught me about ranching, about surviving in this harsh place. And slowly, Texas became home. Not Germany home, but home nonetheless." She paused in her work, staring out the window at the landscape she'd learned to love. "We had 2 sons. Michael, born in 1925, Thomas, born in 1928. We raised them as Americans. They spoke English without accents. They played American football. They believed in American ideals. But they knew their mother's language, and I told them stories about the old country, about their heritage. The kitchen had grown quiet, except for the sounds of cooking knives on cutting boards, water running, the gentle bubble of soup on the stove. The prisoners worked with their heads down, but every one of them was listening. When the war began in Europe, Katharina continued, her voice taking on a harder edge. My boys were still young. Michael was 14, Thomas 11. We listened to radio broadcasts about Germany invading Poland, then France, then Russia. Wilhelm would rage at the radio, calling Hitler a madman who would destroy Germany just as the Kaiser had. I was conflicted. Part of me still loved the country I'd left. Part of me wanted to believe that Germany had good reasons, that we'd been wronged after the First War, that our grievances were legitimate. She looked directly at the prisoners now, her gaze steady and unflinching. But as more news came, as we heard about the camps, about the murders, about the systematic extermination of Jews and others deemed unworthy, I could not lie to myself anymore. The country I remembered, the Germany of my childhood, had become something monstrous, and I grieved for that loss as much as I later grieved for my sons. Margareta's hands stilled over the peas she'd been shelling. You knew? About the camps? We? She trailed off, unable or unwilling to complete the thought. Americans knew, Katharina said quietly. Not everything, not the full scope, but enough. The question was never whether we knew. The question was what we chose to believe, what we chose to ignore, what we told ourselves to make the knowledge bearable. She returned her attention to the dumplings. I imagine it was similar in Germany. People knew things. They chose not to know them. The human capacity for selective blindness is remarkable when confronting truth becomes too painful. According to documentation from the Library of Congress Veterans History Project, many German civilians and conscripted soldiers described exactly this phenomenon. The awareness of terrible things happening alongside the psychological mechanisms that allowed them to continue functioning without confronting those realities directly. The women in Katharina's kitchen understood this intimately, even if they couldn't articulate it. When America entered the war, Katharina continued, Michael was 16, Thomas 13. We knew Michael would eventually have to serve. We hoped the war would end before that became necessary. It didn't. He enlisted on his 18th birthday in 1943. He was eager, proud to defend his country. He went to Europe in 1944 and died on the beach at Normandy on June 6th. He was 19 years old. He never saw his 20th birthday. Her voice remained remarkably steady, though her hands paused in their work. Thomas enlisted 6 months later, angry about his brother's death, wanting revenge. He fought through France and into Germany. At the Battle of the Bulge in December of 1944, a grenade took his left arm at the shoulder. He survived, but he came home changed. The boy who left was not the man who returned. Ilse looked up, tears streaming down her face. Frau Hoffmann, why would you invite us here? We served the army that killed Michael. We supported the regime that took Thomas's arm. How can you bear to look at us? Katharina set down her measuring cup and wiped her hands on her apron. She walked to where Ilse stood and placed both hands on the younger woman's shoulders. When Thomas came home, he was full of rage. He would wake screaming from nightmares. He would sit for hours staring at nothing, trapped in memories I couldn't reach. The Veterans Hospital tried to help, but he was drowning in hatred. Hatred for Germans, for the war, for the injury that had taken his arm, for the brother who died while he survived. She released Ilse and returned to the counter, but continued speaking. One day, perhaps 6 months after he came home, I found him in the barn with his father's pistol. He was going to kill himself. The pain, the guilt, the hatred, it had become unbearable. I talked him out of it that day, but I knew something had to change or I would lose him too, just more slowly. The kitchen was utterly silent now. Even the sounds of cooking had stopped as every woman listened to Katharina's story. I began volunteering at the Veterans Hospital, she said. I spoke with doctors, with other mothers, with Thomas's fellow soldiers, and I learned something important. Hatred is a poison that destroys the person carrying it. Thomas was being consumed from the inside by his rage at Germans, and I realized that as long as Germans remained abstract enemies, monsters in his mind, he would never heal. He needed to see that Germans were people, flawed, broken people like everyone else the war had touched. She looked around the kitchen at the 15 German women who'd come to her home. So I wrote to Camp Swift. I asked about the German prisoners there. I learned about the women, about their stories, about the fact that they were not SS officers or concentration camp guards, but telephone operators and clerks and nurses who'd been conscripted into service. And I thought, these women could have been me. If I had stayed in Germany, if I had been their age during this war, I might have been exactly like them. Greta felt something crack inside her chest. You did this for your son? To help him heal? Partly, Katharina admitted, but also for myself. I needed to forgive, or I would be consumed by the same hatred eating Thomas alive. And perhaps... She paused, choosing her words carefully. Perhaps I did it for you as well. You are prisoners in a foreign land. You have lost everything. You face an uncertain future. You deserve, at minimum, to be treated as human beings rather than abstractions of evil. Anna, the youngest, spoke for the first time since entering the house. Frau Hoffmann. I was 17 when they conscripted me. I didn't understand what I was supporting. By the time I understood, it was too late. We all saw things, knew things, but we were afraid. We told ourselves we had no choice. Does that make us less guilty? Katharina considered the question seriously. Guilt is complicated. You were 17. You were following orders in a system designed to punish disobedience with death. But you were also making choices within that system, small choices, perhaps, but choices nonetheless. I cannot absolve you of guilt. That is not my place. But I can acknowledge that guilt exists on a spectrum, and that a 17-year-old telephone operator bears different responsibility than the men who designed the camps. She returned to her work, signalling that the heaviest part of the conversation had passed. Now, enough philosophy. The food will not cook itself, and I promised you Sunday dinner, not a seminar on moral culpability. Greta, could you check the chicken? Margaretha, the potatoes should be ready to mash. The women returned to their tasks, but something had shifted. The formality had dissolved, replaced by a cautious comfort that allowed genuine conversation to develop. As they cooked, they talked about food, about recipes their mothers had made, about the small domestic rituals that had structured their lives before the war. Ilse described her grandmother's recipe for sauerbraten, and Katharina laughed with recognition. My mother made that. I have not tasted it in 20 years. The vinegar marinade, yes? And the ginger snap gravy? Exactly. But finding proper ingredients in Hamburg during the war was impossible. We substituted until the dish bore no resemblance to what she'd originally made. Conversations multiplied around the kitchen. Margaretha and Anna discussed the differences between Saxon and Bavarian dialects. Several women asked Katharina about ranching, genuinely curious about this alien landscape they'd been forced to inhabit. She explained about cattle, about the challenges of drought and the constant battle against invasive mesquite, about the independence and isolation of rural Texas life. Do you miss Germany? Greta asked. Even after all these years, do you miss it? Katharina was quiet for a long moment, stirring gravy with careful attention. I miss the Germany that existed in my memory, she said finally. The Bavaria of my childhood, the mountains, the festivals, the sense of place and tradition. But that Germany is gone. Maybe it never existed the way I remember it. Maybe memory is always a revision, a simplification. What I know is that this, she gestured to encompass the house, the ranch, the endless Texas sky beyond the windows. This is my home now. And Germany, whatever it becomes after this war, will never again be the place I left. By 11:30, the meal was ready. The table groaned under the weight of roast chicken, mashed potatoes, gravy, vegetables, prepared 3 different ways, fresh bread, and apple pie that Katharina had baked the previous day. It was more food than the prisoners had seen in months, possibly years. The abundance itself felt obscene given what they knew about conditions in defeated Germany, where civilians were starving amid the rubble. As they took their seats around the extended table, Katharina stood at the head. "Before we eat," she said, "I want to say something. This meal is not about forgetting what happened. It is not about pretending the war didn't occur or that the choices we all made or didn't make don't matter. This meal is about acknowledging that despite everything, we are all still here, still human, still capable of sitting together and breaking bread. That may not seem like much, but in this moment, it is enough." She sat down, and for a heartbeat, nobody moved. Then Greta reached for the chicken platter, and the moment broke. The women began serving themselves, passing dishes, murmuring thanks in German and broken English. The guards, who'd been invited to eat at a smaller table by the window, watched with visible surprise at how natural it all appeared. The first bites were tentative, almost reverent. Ilse closed her eyes as she tasted the mashed potatoes, and tears leaked from beneath her eyelids. Margarita ate slowly, savouring each mouthful as though trying to memorize the flavours. Anna devoured her plate with the unself-conscious hunger of youth, then looked embarrassed until Katharina smiled and gestured for her to take more. Conversation during the meal was lighter, carefully avoiding the heaviest topics they'd already covered. Katharina asked about their families, about their lives before the war, about their hopes for afterwards. The prisoners answered haltingly at first, then with increasing ease, as the food and warmth and unexpected kindness loosened the tight bands of fear and shame they'd carried for so long. Greta found herself describing her childhood in Frankfurt, the annual Christmas markets, her father's bookshop, her younger brother's obsession with train sets. The memory hurt, but it also felt good to speak of them, to acknowledge that they'd existed and mattered even though they were gone. Ilse talked about working as a telephone operator in Hamburg, before the war, about the camaraderie among the other operators, about the pride she'd felt in doing important work. She didn't mention what that work had supported, but everyone at the table understood the unspoken context. Margarita spoke about Dresden before the firebombing, the art, the architecture, the cultural richness of a city that had considered itself the Florence of the North. "I cannot even imagine it now," she said quietly. "They say the city is gone, just gone, as though it never existed." Katharina reached across the table and squeezed Margarita's hand. "I am sorry. Truly. No civilian population deserves what happened to Dresden. War makes monsters of all nations eventually." If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. After the main course, Katharina served the apple pie, each slice generous and topped with cream she'd whipped that morning. The sweetness felt almost painful after months of bland camp food. But it was a good pain, the ache of remembering that pleasure still existed in the world. As they ate dessert, Margarita asked the question that had been building throughout the meal. "Frau Hoffmann, what happens to us after the war, after we're repatriated to Germany? We have lost everything." Our families, our homes, our country itself. What future exists for German women who served the Wehrmacht? Knight. Katharina set down her fork and considered the question seriously. "I don't know," she admitted. "Germany will have to rebuild, physically and morally. That will take decades. You will have to live with the knowledge of what your country did, what you helped enable through your service, even if that help was indirect. That burden will never fully lift." She paused, choosing her next words carefully. "But you are young. You survived. And survival, I have learned, is itself a form of resistance against the forces of destruction. You have choices ahead of you, not easy choices, but choices nonetheless. You can let guilt consume you, or you can live in ways that honor the dead and work toward ensuring such catastrophe never happens again. You can become the Germans who remember, who bear witness, who refuse to let the world forget or minimize what occurred. That is a heavy responsibility, Greta said quietly. Yes, but someone must carry it. And better you, who understand the cost, than those who would prefer comfortable lies. The meal wound down naturally, the conversation softening into companionable silence as the women finished their pie. Several helped clear dishes despite Katharina's protests, falling into the familiar rhythms of shared domestic work. The kitchen filled with the sounds of washing and drying, of women working together in the ancient ritual of cleaning up after a meal. Captain Morrison appeared in the doorway, checking her watch. "We need to depart in 15 minutes, she said, her tone apologetic. The prisoners nodded, the reminder of their status as prisoners crashing back over them like cold water. As they prepared to leave, Katharina pulled Greta aside. "There is something I want to give you," she said, leading Greta to a small room off the kitchen that served as her sewing space. From a drawer, she withdrew a photograph in a simple frame, the same image Greta had seen on the mantelpiece, showing two young men in American uniforms. "This is Michael and Thomas," Katharina said. "I want you to have it, not to burden you with guilt, but to remember that they were real, that everyone the war touched was real, that the categories of enemy and ally, victim and perpetrator are never as simple as we need them to be." Greta took the photograph with trembling hands. "I don't deserve this." "Probably not, but I'm giving it to you anyway." Katharina's expression was firm. "You asked me earlier why I wanted this dinner. The full truth is that I needed to look into the faces of German women and see my own reflection, see the woman I might have been if geography and timing had been different. I needed to acknowledge that evil is not something distant and foreign, but something any nation, any person, can commit given the right circumstances. That is a hard truth, but it is the truth." She placed her hand on Greta's shoulder. "Promise me something. When you return to Germany, when you try to rebuild your life, don't hide what you saw and did. Don't pretend the war was something other than what it was. Bear witness. Remember. Make sure the next generation knows the full cost of hatred and nationalism taken to their logical extremes." "I promise," Greta whispered, clutching the photograph. "I will remember. All of it." The prisoners gathered in the yard for departure, their faces reflecting complex emotions: gratitude, confusion, grief, and something that might have been hope. Katharina stood on her porch, watching them prepare to leave, and raised her hand in farewell. As the trucks pulled away, Greta looked back to see Katharina still standing there, a small figure against the vast Texas landscape, waving at women who'd served the army that killed her son. The gesture seemed impossibly generous, incomprehensibly kind, and yet it had happened. It was real. The ride back to Camp Swift was quieter than the journey out. The prisoners sat lost in their own thoughts, processing the impossible afternoon they'd experienced. Ilse leaned against Greta's shoulder, exhausted from the emotional intensity of the day. "Do you think it helped?" Ilse asked quietly. "Her son, I mean. Do you think knowing we're human will help him heal?" "I don't know," Greta replied honestly. "But maybe that's not entirely the point. Maybe the point is that she tried, that she chose forgiveness over hatred, even when hatred would have been justified. That choice itself matters, regardless of the outcome." Margaretha, sitting across from them, added, "My grandmother used to say that we cannot control what happens to us, only how we respond." Frau Hoffmann chose a response that makes the world slightly less broken. That is not nothing. When they arrived back at Camp Swift, the other prisoners surrounded them immediately, demanding to know what had happened. The 15 who'd gone to the Hoffmann ranch tried to explain, but found the experience resistant to simple description. How could you convey the strangeness of being treated as guests by a woman whose sons you'd fought against? How could you capture the feeling of sitting at a table laden with food, experiencing ordinary human kindness from someone who had every reason to hate you? That evening, Greta sat on her bunk in the barracks, studying the photograph Katharina had given her. Michael and Thomas Hoffmann smiled out from the frame, young and confident in their uniforms, unaware of the futures that awaited them. She thought about the arbitrary nature of national identity, how if her family had immigrated 20 years earlier, she might have worn an American uniform instead of a German one. She might have been one of the women serving those prisoners rather than being a prisoner herself. According to records from the National Archives, the repatriation of German prisoners from American camps began in earnest in November of 1945 and continued through 1946. Most prisoners were sent first to France and Britain to help with reconstruction before being allowed to return to occupied Germany. The women from Camp Swift followed this pattern, being transferred to work camps in France in early 1946. Greta would eventually return to Frankfurt in late 1946, finding the city almost unrecognizable beneath its layers of rubble. She worked for 3 years helping clear debris and rebuild infrastructure, using the skills she'd learned in the Wehrmacht's communications division to help establish telephone service in the occupied zones. She married a fellow former auxiliary in 1949, had 2 daughters, and spent the rest of her life working as a telephone operator in the rebuilt Frankfurt Exchange. But she kept the photograph of Michael and Thomas Hoffmann on her bedside table until her death in 1998. She told her daughters about the Sunday dinner, about the German-American woman who chose forgiveness over hatred, about the lesson that enemies are only enemies until you see their humanity. Her daughters told their children, and the story rippled outward through the generations, a small story, perhaps, but one that captured something essential about the possibility of reconciliation even after catastrophic violence. Ilse Bachmann returned to Hamburg and discovered that her apartment building had been destroyed in the bombing raids. She lived in displaced persons camps for 2 years before finding work as a secretary for the British occupation forces. She never married, never had children, but she became active in German-American reconciliation efforts in the 1950s, organizing exchange programs for students and working to build bridges between former enemies. She corresponded with Katharina Hoffmann until Katharina's death in 1967 and attended her funeral in Texas, one of only 3 Germans present among the hundreds of Americans who came to honor the rancher's wife, who'd lost 2 sons but refused to lose her humanity. Margareta Klein became a teacher in West Berlin, spending 30 years educating students about the Holocaust and World War II. She made it her mission to ensure that German students understood their country's history without flinching from uncomfortable truths. She told them about the Sunday dinner in Texas, about the woman who'd shown her what forgiveness looked like, about the responsibility of memory. She died in 1992, having touched thousands of lives with her insistence on honest historical reckoning. Anna Schultz, the youngest, struggled the most after repatriation. She married young, divorced young, worked a series of unsatisfying jobs, and battled depression for decades. But she eventually found purpose working with victims of trauma, using her own experiences to help others process guilt and grief. She credited Katharina Hoffmann's example with teaching her that redemption was possible even for those who'd served evil systems, that the work of healing could span lifetimes. As for Katharina Hoffmann herself, she continued running the ranch with her husband Wilhelm until his death in 1958. Thomas, her surviving son, did eventually heal, though he carried the physical and psychological scars of war until his death in 1983. He credited his mother's intervention both in preventing his suicide and in forcing him to see Germans as human beings, with saving his life. Katharina never fully explained, even to her family, why she'd felt compelled to invite enemy women to her table. When asked, she would simply say that she'd been taught as a child that hospitality was sacred, that bread shared created bonds stronger than national allegiance, that the deepest human duty was to see the humanity in everyone, especially those easiest to categorize as monsters. In 1972, a German television crew making a documentary about the POW experience in America tracked down Katharina and interviewed her about that October Sunday in 1945. In grainy footage preserved in German archives, she sat on her porch at age 67, her face weathered but her eyes still sharp, and offered this reflection: People ask if I forgave those German women. That's not the right question. Forgiveness implies I had something personally to forgive them for. They didn't kill my sons. The war killed my sons, the war and all the choices and failures and hatreds that made the war possible. Those women were caught up in something larger than themselves, just as my sons were. What I offered them was not forgiveness, but recognition, the acknowledgement that they were human beings who'd suffered and who deserved to be treated accordingly. That's not complicated. That's just basic human decency. When the interviewer asked if she had any regrets about the dinner, Katharina smiled. Only that I couldn't do more. 15 women out of millions affected by the war, it was such a small gesture. But perhaps small gestures matter. Perhaps they're all we have. The evening of October 21st, 1945, ended as it had begun with German women prisoners behind the fences of Camp Swift, with American guards watching over them, with the machinery of occupation and repatriation grinding forward according to its inexorable schedule. In the grand scope of World War II and its aftermath, one Sunday dinner in rural Texas, registered as barely a footnote, a minor incident unlikely to appear in serious history of the conflict. But for the 15 women who sat at Greta Hoffmann's table, for the rancher's wife who chose hospitality over hatred, for the wounded son whose mother's example showed him a path through darkness, for the daughters and granddaughters who would hear these stories and carry them forward for all of them, that October afternoon represented something crucial, proof that even after the most catastrophic failure of human civilization, even in the midst of justified grief and anger, even when enemies remained enemies in law and fact, the moments of genuine human connection remained possible. The war had shattered millions of lives, had destroyed cities and countries, had revealed depths of human evil previously unimaginable. But it had not succeeded in destroying every capacity for kindness, every impulse toward reconciliation, every moment when someone chose to see the person rather than the enemy. In a Texas ranch house, over roast chicken and apple pie, a small miracle occurred, not the miracle of forgetting or easy forgiveness, but the harder miracle of acknowledgement. Enemies remained enemies, but they also became something more. Women who shared stories and recipes, who mourned together for everything the war had taken, who broke bread and discovered that hatred, while justified, was not the only possible response to grief. That choice to offer hospitality rather than hatred, to see humanity rather than only enemy, to break bread rather than maintain the boundaries war had drawn rippled outward through decades and generations. It shaped how Greta raised her daughters, how Ilse built bridges between nations, how Margaretha taught history, how Anna helped others heal. It gave Thomas Hoffmann a reason to keep living when death had seemed easier. The war ended, the prisoners went home, the wounds slowly scarred over, never fully healing but becoming bearable. And somewhere in the archives of family memory, preserved in photographs and stories and the lessons passed from grandmother to grandchild, the story of one Sunday dinner endured a small light against the darkness, a reminder that even after catastrophe, even in the depths of justified anger, the choice to be human remains possible. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.